Greetings, everyone. I'm Freya Mathews, speaking to you today from Melbourne, Naarm, in southeastern Australia, from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'm sorry not to be with you today in real time, but please let me say right at the outset that if anyone has any comments or queries arising from the lecture, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me by email. I should also say that I'll mainly be reading this lecture. I'm very low tech. I like to rely on the ancient technology of the spoken argument. So I'll try to carry you along on the flow of the argument rather than resorting to dot points and diagrams and images and such like. So really, the presentation would work better as radio than as television. So please do feel free to turn off the video and just listen. So where to start? Most of us here would agree, I think, that the reductive materialist view of the world that we inherited from the scientific revolution of the 17th century underpins the extreme form of anthropocentrism that drives our modern industrial civilization. By dividing mind so categorically from matter, draining matter per se of every attribute associated with mind, reductive materialism divided the human from nature and instilled in us our characteristic modern sense of human exceptionalism. The rest of nature is a mindless realm that doesn't matter to itself and is therefore available for us to use as we see fit. It's this extreme form of anthropocentrism, together with the ever-escalating technological capacity that modern science has also bequeathed to us, that has unleashed the havoc that civilization today is wreaking on the biosphere. Many of us are accordingly trying to construct alternatives to reductive materialism, trying to provide different metaphysical foundations for the way we humans collectively inhabit our Earth. I think it's probably also fair to suppose that most of us engaged in this search for alternatives would say that we're looking for a more holistic understanding of things. Or maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe this isn't the way that everyone would describe it. But in any case, I imagine a lot of us want a view of things as connected at the most basic level. We want a view that shows the existence and arrangement of things to be not merely ad hoc, as per classical causation, but already implicated, so to speak, in the existence and arrangement of the things around them, configured jigsaw-like by their environs. From this kind of perspective, no part makes sense on its own. All its properties are woven from a larger fabric. This view of interwovenness applies to all properties, including mind. None can be categorically insulated from the wider weave. Mind is no longer then, from this perspective, what separates us from nature. It may rather be the thread that most intimately connects us to it. Once properly apprised of this, we'll presumably no longer act as overlords at liberty to rearrange our natural environment to suit our own convenience, but we'll approach it with an entirely different attitude. In some ways, of course, contemporary science also seems to be heading in this holistic direction, after starting out back in the 17th century with its fully fledged atomism. Today, fundamental sciences like physics are filled with fields of various kinds and with ideas of entanglement and non-locality. But I think we need to be cautious in face of this apparent change in the direction of science from its classical origins. In the first place, contemporary science still seeks to represent reality basically in quantitative mathematical terms. This is, of course, one of its most definitive characteristics. But mathematical analysis of physical phenomena relies on metrics, on the measurability of variables, and measurability presupposes countable units of measurement. At least at an explanatory level, then, science does still require that phenomena be broken down into units. The second reason we need to be cautious about regarding science as currently heading in a holistic direction is, I think, to do with its distinctive way of learning. The scientist, as knower, positions herself at a remove from reality. Rather than immersing herself as an engaged agent in her field of interest, she steps back and assumes the stance of a detached and neutral observer. On the basis of her observations, she constructs a theory, and it's through the lens of such an abstract schema, this theory, that she arrives at her distinctively scientific form of understanding. But the schema she constructs is, of course, her own creation. Though theories themselves vary according to the phenomena under investigation, in all cases, the scientist remains the author, the active party in relation to the theory. She acts on it, but the theory does not act on her. As its creator, she is always at a meta level relative to it. She's not part of the theory. Insofar as scientists see the world through the lens of theory, then, they remain psychologically, or as philosophers would say, phenomenologically, outside the world. Phenomenologically speaking, they always investigate things from the outside, where this inevitably gives the lie, at that phenomenological level, to any presumption of holism. The scientific knower continues to feel subtly separate from reality, however holistically his theory might attempt to represent the world. A truly holistic way of understanding reality would therefore, it seems, have to situate knowers themselves inside the world they seek to know. This implies, I think, that holistic understanding can only be achieved via direct experiences of rapprochement with reality, rather than via the distancing lens of theory. The knower must make himself available to be acted upon by the world, rather than reserving for himself the prerogative of acting. He must, in other words, be prepared to be touched by the world, subjectively moved and rearranged by it. He'll understand things as much by how they change him as by the appearances they passively present to him or the effects his experimental methods have on them. In this sense, then, holism may ultimately elude the net of theoretical analysis, particularly the kind of quantitative mathematical analysis pursued by science. If this is so, it implies that the holistic aspect of reality can only be glimpsed through participative and qualitative frameworks. In some instances, philosophical, but in other instances, perhaps narrative or ceremonial. Participative and qualitative frameworks are, of course, always specific to particular cultures and are hence necessarily interpretive. They can never nail down reality with the literalness and predictive power that science, as far as it goes, can deliver. It follows that there are likely to be many different, equally sound, though partial, ways of articulating holism, as opposed to the exclusiveness of any presumptive final scientific articulation. Nevertheless, scientific theorizations do surely remain crucial in our current crisis of civilization because they can point towards holism by showing how purely mathematical analysis breaks down at the limits of empirical investigation, and by demonstrating, to those of us looking on, the way the very methodology of science prevents it from revealing the biggest truth about reality, even while it captures a myriad of structural details. In these ways, science implicitly helps to guide us towards alternative, participative, and interpretive approaches, which will hopefully, in turn, motivate new ways of inhabiting reality. Okay, so now I'm at part 2 of the lecture. With all these qualifiers then, let me outline the version of holism that I've been developing over many years. As I've explained, I'm under no illusion that it is or could be in any way definitive. It's rather a purely interpretive account of the nature of things, one that is anchored in a selection of culturally specific categories. As I'm a philosopher, and ancient enough myself to be a bit of an elder in this field, it might not be out of line to preface my account with a few remarks about my own particular journey, which started out a long time ago with my life-changing encounter with the 17th century philosopher Spinoza. As a young undergraduate, I had enrolled in philosophy because I had a sense of the enigma of how we're meant to inhabit reality. Somehow or other, I had strayed from my home in Australia in my late teens and found myself in London, where I thought to pursue my interest in this enigma at London University. But this was the early 1970s, and the influence of logical positivism and ordinary language philosophy was still strong. Most of my teachers were scornfully dismissive of any kind of systematic metaphysics, the kind of metaphysics that asks how the nature of reality at large illumines questions about how we as humans ought to live. After a year of frustration, I wanted to drop philosophy and switch to anthropology. Could have been a good move. But then I was retrieved by a very tuned-in tutor who understood my penchant for that kind of systematic metaphysics, not that I could name it at the time, and took me back to the 17th century, to the rationalists, where it was there, of course, that I met Spinoza. I knew straight away that this was it, that this was what I'd been looking for. I happily studied nothing but Spinoza for a year, and it was as if I received direct transmission from his great book, The Ethics. Not its axioms and proofs, etc., or its medieval categories, but its core intuitions around the idea of reality as a self-differentiating unity. These core intuitions have stayed with me always, though I had to plow through a doctorate on modal logic and years of teaching sundry stuff before I could really start putting those intuitions to work in the context, the perfect context of environmental philosophy, the discourse par excellence about how to inhabit reality. Mind you, I had to wait for environmental philosophy to be invented, which didn't really happen until the late 1980s. And Spinoza has indeed served me well, as I hope very, very humbly to have also served him. His vision has provided a sturdy base on which to craft a vessel equal to the great challenges of the 20th century and the even greater challenges of the 21st century. Where this is what I, like Spinoza, believe metaphysics to be for, to align us with reality so that we can live right way, as Aboriginal people here in Australia put it. Of course, there have been many other philosophical influences along the way. The inspired 19th century mathematician William Clifford with his space theory of matter, and subsequent proponents of such geometrodynamics, such as Einstein and John Archibald Wheeler, the physicist-philosopher David Bohm, a number of historians of science, especially Morris Berman, the indispensable insights of general systems theory, and, of course, some of my friends and colleagues in environmental philosophy, such as Val Plumwood and Deborah Rose. Indigenous influences have also been key, particularly the many wonderful Aboriginal scholars and authors currently writing here in Australia. The great philosophers of Taoism, the indigenous tradition of ancient China, have been equally key. Landscape itself, in addition to texts, likewise, I think, always exerts a powerful influence. Moulding, via resonance, one's intuitions and suffusing them with ecological hues and moods of its own. In any case, the version of holism that has come together for me over these decades and out of this particular skein of cultural influences is one that I've come to call living cosmos panpsychism, and I'll try to give you a tiny taster of this view. When I get my screen lighted again. Okay, so now we come to part 3. So, to approach the idea of living cosmos panpsychism, let's start with bedrock questions of metaphysics, the kinds of questions that physics has not historically addressed. These include questions such as, why is the universe we can see for ourselves when we look up at the night sky, why is it a universe, a unity? Why does it cohere, hang together in the way that it does, rather than breaking apart? And why, relatedly, is it spatial? Why is space as it is, unbounded, yet unbroken, an indivisible wholeness, a field-like manifold? Why doesn't it too break up, fragment, and hence cease to be field-like? Physics itself, as I said, has not historically addressed such questions. It posits presumptive laws that hold physical structures together and thereby secure the overall cohering of things, but it doesn't explain why those particular laws hold. From its viewpoint, this cohering is ad hoc, contingent. There is nothing in the nature of existence per se that appears to underpin it. It's true that physicists are currently wondering about some of their founding presuppositions, such as the idea that space is a continuum, because they've found that mathematics, as I mentioned a moment ago, tends to break down at the limits of the measurable. But physicists, of course, try to resolve the ever-proliferating anomalies of their discourse with that same mathematical method. Cosmological panpsychism, or the version I'm presenting here, seeks a different kind of answer to such questions. To the question of why the universe coheres as an indivisible spatial unity, it points out that as soon as a mental dimension is granted as foundational to the nature of physicality per se, then the necessity of this cohering is explained. For the quality of mind, or let's call it subjectivity, is itself, by its very nature, field-like, holistic, internally interpermeating, indivisible, unbounded. Subjectivity cannot be constituted atomistically as an aggregate of discrete units of experience, or even as a continuum of point-like experiences. This doesn't need to be experimentally demonstrated. We can attest to it directly via introspection. If mentality is as primal as is physicality in the overall scheme of things, then it follows that physical existence must exhibit the same fundamental indivisibility and field-likeness as mind does. The indivisibility and field-likeness paradigmatically exhibited by space. Of course, our next question is likely to be, why is mind in itself field-like and indivisible? I'd argue that this is because mind is a function of meaning, or of the meaningfulness that inheres in beings or systems with a constitutive interest in their own existence. The investment that such beings or systems have in their own continued existence renders all that happens to them and all that happens around them potentially meaningful to them. In other words, to preserve their existence, they need to be able to perceive reality. But perceiving reality is already a matter of registering the significance of all its elements and aspects to their interests. Meaningfulness subtends experience in this sense, and the nature of meaning is again intrinsically indivisible. Different meanings pervade, interpermeate, and inflect one another, morphing according to context. Mind, as the province of meaningfulness, then, must share this field-like quality of indivisibility. Now, systems with a constitutive interest in their own existence are commonly understood as living systems. Living systems are, if we follow onto-poetic type definitions of life, organized precisely so as to preserve and increase their own existence. Living systems are, in other words, self-realizing systems. Mind, then, according to this argument, is the province of living systems. So, if we grant ex hypothesi that the cosmos as a whole is intrinsically imbued with mind, then it follows, according to the argument for meaning, that the cosmos is itself a living system, where this is actually borne out by the fact that the universe is demonstrably self-actualizing, self-maintaining, and self-increasing. In a word, self-realizing. Spinoza had a term for the will to self-existence. It was conatus, from which we can derive the word conativity. Let's call conative beings, that is, beings with a will to self-existence, selves. Selves are conative systems with a constitutive interest in self-realization. So, let me summarize this first stage of the argument for living cosmos panpsychism. We can explain why the universe appears to us as a spatial manifold, an indivisible extended unity that intrinsically, rather than contingently, coheres, if a mental dimension is granted from the outset as foundational to the nature of physicality per se. Folded into this argument, as we've seen, is the idea that mind is a function of meaningfulness, and hence ultimately of self-mattering, where from this it follows that if the universe as a whole has an inner mental dimension, then this must be because it matters to itself. In other words, it must be because it is a conative system, a self-realizing system, a living cosmos. Now we come to part 4. And in part 4, we'll go to the second stage of the argument for living cosmos panpsychism. And this is the stage where we come into the picture. Although this living cosmos coheres as a unity, it also, of course, undergoes self-differentiation. Such self-differentiation clearly features as a major aspect of its self-realization and self-increase. The field-like fabric of the cosmos ripples and folds locally to form a dynamic manifold of ever-changing finite disturbances. Under their spatial aspect, these disturbances are understood as geometrodynamic type patterns, while under their mental aspect, they are patterns of experience. Following Spinoza again, let's call these local disturbances modes of the cosmic substance. Now, among these modes or differentia are some that have undergone sufficient, though always relative, individuation to count as relatively self-realizing systems in their own right, thereby distinguishing themselves from within their own perspective from their immediate environs. Such local or finite modes will accordingly qualify as relative selves. They include organisms and possibly higher order living systems such as ecosystems and biospheres. When selves are understood as finite modes of a cosmos that is structured by its own connative ends, it is clear that those selves must contribute in their own small ways to those larger ends. The ultimate purpose of their existence within this larger scheme must be to further the overall self-realization of the cosmos. Since we humans are, of course, selves in this special sense, it follows that our own role in this panpsychic scheme of things is also to contribute in some way to the ongoing unfolding of the cosmos, to its ongoing self-renewal and self-increase. But what could this contribution be? How can we discover it? I want to pick out two key concepts here that can help us to answer this question. The first concept is ontopoetics, and the second is deep law, capital D, capital L, deep law. Okay, starting with ontopoetics. To see what I mean by ontopoetics, let's remember that, from the perspective of the living cosmos, the special capacities of organisms, such as their capacity to feel, think, and communicate, must constitute an enrichment for the cosmos of its own field of experience. These capacities clearly afford new possibilities of experience, the kind of possibilities inherent in plurality and finitude as opposed to unity and universality. Plurality and finitude allow for a multiplicity of perspectives, enabling relationality and dialogue, and all the possibilities of increased reflexivity and affectiveness in what might otherwise be the blandness of unitive awareness. But in addition to these further dimensions of enrichment that organisms bring to the larger field of awareness, there is a possibility that tends to be overlooked in modern societies. This is the possibility of communication between organisms and the cosmos itself. Such a form of communication would surely open up altogether new registers of experience. It might also prove vital in containing the risks that the introduction of finite selves might otherwise pose to the project of cosmic self-realization, at least locally. The suggestion that we as humans do have a capacity to engage in such a form of communication, and that the universe has both the capacity and the inclination to respond in kind, is what lies behind the idea of ontopoetics. What then might a communicative exchange between ourselves and the cosmos look like? This isn't, in fact, an entirely unfamiliar phenomenon. Many of us have been visited at some point in our lives by a certain kind of experience which, though striking, confounds our modern cultural categories. We have no way of processing it within the terms of the received discourses of our society. In pre-modern societies, experiences of this kind were sometimes read as omens or signs. In indigenous societies, they may be understood as references to old or new dreamings. In a more contemporary Western context, Carl Jung spoke of synchronicities, mysterious manifestations in the outer environment of inner states of a person's psyche, manifestations that Jung named but was unable to explain. Omens, signs, dreamings, synchronicities. These terms suggest in their different ways instances of I-thou encounter between self and something larger, moments when that something larger seems to speak directly to the human self in a language that is both opposite and intimate. Let's step back from earlier interpretations of this mysterious phenomenon and view it instead, again for the sake of argument, as an instance of direct communicative encounter between ourselves and the living cosmos. In order for such a communicative encounter to occur, we presumably first need to assume a stance of address. We need, in some basically ceremonial way, to invoke the cosmos. If the cosmos responds to our invocation, its response will be recognizable as a response because it will deploy the terms of reference of the invocation itself. Of course, the language that the cosmos will speak in response to our invocations can only be a concrete one. It will be the language of poetics, of imagery, of meaning conveyed through the symbolic resonance of things. It is in such language, traditionally the language of both poetic narrative and dreams, that our invocations need to be couched, so that they may in due course be answered in the same language, this language of things. The term ontopoetics is intended to capture this cluster of meanings. Ontos, from the ancient Greek word for being, or for having the status of an existent thing, and poetics, both in its modern sense and in a sense drawn from the ancient Greek poiesis, making or creating. Reality is, from the ontopoetic point of view, not only informed with meanings of its own, but it's disposed to interact with us on the level of meaning to create new poetic configurations. The history of religion is full of what I'm calling ontopoetic moments. Think of the Old Testament, the burning bushes, parting seas, pillars of cloud by day and of fire by night, significant rainbows or bolts of lightning, unusual celestial bodies, all might be interpreted as responses on the part of a living cosmos to implicit invocations framed by the theistic poetic narrative of the Hebrew religion. Ontopoetics is not, however, merely the province of religions. Many of us will remember significant moments in our own lives when something like a sign appeared in our physical environment, legible in terms of our own private or shared frame of reference, as if in response to an implied invocation. It might be a rainbow. It might be finding a gold ring on a track in some out-of-the-way place. It might be a sudden visitation by a wild animal. Whatever it is, when I do invoke the world ceremonially by way of such a narrative frame of reference, and when the world responds to me with an emanation or conjunction of circumstances clearly referenced to that same story, I can't fail to be stunned. There is such intimacy in the revelation, such largesse in the gesture, such unexpectedness. One can hardly help but surrender to the experience. One's heart is opened up to an entirely new register of salience and purpose. It's through onto-poetic communion, then, I want to suggest, that the living cosmos pulls us into relationship with itself, and from thence into alignment with deep law. So we come to deep law, capital D, capital L. So what is deep law? The living cosmos must presumably unfold itself in accordance with a normative logic that is conducive to its own ongoing self-realization. If we exist only as modes of the cosmic connectivity, we need to try to discover this normative logic so that we can ally our own lives with it and thereby contribute effectively to cosmic unfolding, since this is the larger purpose of our existence. But what is this logic? Well, we find our clue, I'd suggest, in ecology. There is a distinctive strategy discernible in stable ecosystems that enables living things collectively to maintain and increase their existence most effectively. This strategy is basically one of accommodation. Each living thing seeks to satisfy its own conative needs in ways that least disrupt the connectivities of others. Indeed, ideally, creatures fulfill their needs in ways that support the connectivities of others, providing life-giving opportunities or resources for them. The best example of this logic is perhaps provided by what biologists call ecosystem engineers. And the best known example of an ecosystem engineer is the famous beaver. In damming waterways to provide safe refuges for themselves, beavers redirect stream flows, in the process opening up wetlands that provide habitat for myriads of other plant and animal species which in turn keep the waterways themselves, on which beavers depend, healthy. Healthy ecosystems are generally held together and continually regenerated by countless such synergies. Uh-oh, losing my screen again. Just need to pause for a minute. Sorry. My screen's going dark. I think I've got it back. Sorry. Just bear with me for a minute. I have to find it again. We were at beavers. Nearly there. Okay, so healthy ecosystems are generally held together and continually regenerated by countless such synergies. This way of accommodation, of wanting only what one's eco-neighbors need one to want, is logically the most efficient strategy for connative beings because it's a way of least resistance. When we all take only what our environment freely affords us, using strategies that at the same time also provide affordances for our ecological neighbors, we individually secure our own existence with the least expenditure of effort, while enabling others to do the same. And when we minimize effort, the effort we expend in meeting our needs, we win a selective advantage over those who engage in unnecessary exertion. Since the energy thereby conserved by us can later be devoted to other aspects of our survival. This logic of accommodation, which is at the same time a logic of least resistance, correlates at a deep level with the path of Wu Wei, so central to the practice of Taoism, the indigenous philosophy of ancient China. If we accept these twin principles of connotivity on the one hand and accommodation, or least resistance, on the other, as an intrinsic logic of cosmological unfolding, a normative logic, since highly reflexive beings such as ourselves are not bound to follow it deterministically, then we might describe it as an ought at the core of the is, a deep law that we, as modes of cosmic connotivity, should strive to follow. This notion of deep law also has very strong resonances with Aboriginal notions of law, or first law here in Australia, capital L law and capital F, capital L, first law here in Australia. However, since we humans, as I mentioned, have the capacity for reflexive thought, we can to a certain extent choose our own path through life, at least in the shorter term. We are free to follow the ought at the core of the is, or we can allow ourselves to be sidetracked by cultural rules and conventions that override the mutual accommodation of needs and desires that structure our ecological communities. And this is where ontopoetics comes back into the picture. Once we have experienced the astonishment of ontopoetic encounter, we're likely to be shifted on our metaphysical moorings. We now sense that we are noticed by the cosmos, that the horizons of our existence and significance are far wider and higher than we had ever imagined. This is a new axis of meaning for our lives. We're accountable not merely to our society, but to a cosmos that is aware of us and perhaps even takes the trouble to salute us. This is a new dimension of intimacy, perhaps for us, of love, that calls us into relationship and hence into alignment with deep law. All competing distractions for our attention are by comparison reduced to tawdry irrelevance. From here on, we'll simply be unable to bear to continue living in ways that trash this tender regard and disrupt the poetic order. We have indeed been pulled inside the cosmos into a subjectival dimension, where this is a form of congress that can only be achieved via feeling. Our will has become coincident with cosmic connotivity, and with this, and only with this, I think, we make the transition to a holistic consciousness. So that's the argument, or part of it anyway, aspects of it in a tiny nutshell. And if you've stuck with me this far, then you'll probably be wondering how we can cultivate the sensibilities proper to ontopoetics and deep law in our own lives. Are there specific practices, or indeed specific forms of economic praxis that can be deployed? And of course, the answer is yes, there are many. And there are some that I would particularly love to explore with you, but I can't because I'm completely out of time. But perhaps this question of practice and praxis is something we could take up in one of the follow-up Mind at Large conferences. So thank you so much for your attention.